Okay, we've gone through the index page, just setting up the basic game board. We've talked a little bit about the styles and the importance of position fixed, position relative, and position absolute. Definitely position absolute for the movement of the characters, so we can always get their top and left positions. Now let's focus on the actual game itself. Okay, one of the first things you'll see is we start the jQuery, how we always do, document ready, and we're going to set some global variables. Any variables that are declared up here are global to the entire game board. Okay, and I have to go here, edit, code folding, and control K2. Okay, there we go. Now, anything here is going to be work for any function that you see here, everything. So if it's declared global, that means you can use it anywhere and it will maintain that value. So if pause is set to false, it will stay false unless you change it somewhere down here to be true. The game tick, I'm setting the game tick to be 10 milliseconds. So that means that it's going to be looping through the game every 10 milliseconds. I've got time lapse. You can see I just got a lot of different variables set up here. The next thing I did is right here, I just basically said the start button, I want to show it, and I want to say start, and there it is. So I've replaced the HTML here where it says start. So inside there, I forced it via jQuery to write that start. That's all that tells you to do. It's really simple. And then I've hid all these other things. So I've said don't show all those things that are up here. Hide them. Hide the lives, the scores, all that kind of stuff. Just when you first start the game. Now here's where it gets very interesting. This is creating an array. So what I've done is I'm going to have various monsters or cats, and I'm going to assign a top position and a left position for every cat, a Y direction and an X direction for every cat, and also a speed for every cat. So what I've done is I've created an array. That way I can call them all cats, and then I can just loop through them. And by looping through them, I can actually then get and set the random speeds and random positions of them all and track where all of them are. And at the same time of tracking all of them, we can check if the collisions happen. So it's a nice way of doing it instead of adding multiple different objects. Because I could say, I could create monster top 1, monster left 1, monster direction 1, monster direction X 1, monster speed 1, and then do the same thing for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then what happens is your code gets so long that it becomes very difficult to manage, and then you have to create various collision functions, and you have to keep multiplying the number of objects that you're creating in the DOM as you're progressing through. So where the real work comes, and the real thing about all this stuff here is nothing at the moment, okay? Including the start. All we know is we need a game tick, okay? And so this is where the real stuff begins. So when I open up game tick, it's very simple. This runs the whole game right here, this game tick. And during the game tick, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a timer so that every 10 seconds it just loops through this. It goes bam, 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 bam. Now 10 milliseconds is pretty quick, so it's going like really quick. And during the game tick, we're going to do a lot of things. We're going to move the monsters. So every 10 milliseconds, we're going to move the monsters. Every 10 milliseconds, we're going to move the player. Every 10 milliseconds, we're going to check the collision. So we're going to see if the mouse hits the cat, and we're going to check if the mouse hits the cheese. I could have made this check collision with cat, check collision with cheese. I didn't have to call it 1 and 2, but I just did for this. And then, of course, we're going to check the game status, meaning we're going to check if the time's up, we're going to check if the game's been paused, and we're going to check if the game is over. So that's where all of that happens. And that's it. That runs the whole thing. Now, how do we get it started? Well, we get it started with this on click. So because we're always going to use the dot on click start, so it says, hey, where's the ID start? Well, that's right here. And right now we've set it equal to start. So when we open this, and I can close this function. So now it says when you've clicked it, just don't do what you normally would do for any kind of click option. We're going to say, is the game over? No, set it to false. We're going to set the lives to 3, the score to 0, the level to 1, and the time lapse to be 0. Then here's where we do some things. I set the game timer to be time lapse, so it's going to start at 0 seconds, and I'm going to show it now. So over here it's going to show what was previously hidden. Then I've got the lives. It's going to show those, the score, the level, and it's going to hide the status, hide the game over, and hide the start. That way when the game starts over again, it'll automatically hide those things that we don't want there, but show the things that we do want. Okay. Now, it wouldn't be a game if it didn't have monsters and objects and things. So what I do is I'm going to call this object, I'm going to call this function called add monsters, and I'm going to add a player, and I'm going to add cheese, and I'm going to start the game time, or the game tick, and then the game timer. So I've got a game timer, which is one type of timer, and another is the game tick. Now what this does, this calls the game tick function, and that's it. Then it says, hey, when I've clicked start, do all this stuff, add the monster, add a player, add the cheese, start the game. So now this function gets called, and this thing just goes like that, starts ripping through. And there's also the game timer. So I can show you the game timer first. And the game timer just says, show the game timer, time elapsed. Time goes up by 1 every second. Go up by 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. And it basically just will keep setting the timeout. So this thing will just keep going every second unless the game's paused or we've reached our time limit of 60 seconds, I think it was, or 30 seconds. So if we've reached our time limit, then we stop. If we've paused, then we stop. Otherwise, keep going every 1 second and update the ticker timer in the game. So if you hit start, right now see it's going up, and that's because this is going doot, 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 like that. Okay, so that's the game timer. The game tick, this is the one that moves the characters and all that kind of stuff. It calls the function up here. I want this to run. So it starts to run, and it says move the monsters. Well, first of all, let's do the check game status, and I'll show you how we add the players. So the check game status. Now there's a lot here. If pause equals true, stop the game. Else if game end equals true, or a number of lives is less than or equal to 0, or the time limit's reached, stop the game, say it that it's game over, hide the lives, hide the score, hide the level, hide the game timer, and show the start button. If none of these are true, if it's not pause, if it's not game over, if the number of lives aren't less than or equal to 0, then run the game time. So run the function and do it every game time tick. I think we set to 10. Run it every 10 milliseconds. So while it's a self-calling function, so in the first one we said call game tick, bam, called game tick, run through, check the game status, and it comes over and says game status. Is it paused? No. Is any of this true? No. Okay, then reset the window and rerun that function every 10th of a second, or yeah, every 10th of a second. And it goes doot, 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 or 10 milliseconds, doot, 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 and it keeps doing it. And that's the heart of the whole game right there. That's the big part of it. Okay, so we've talked about the game tick. Let's add some monsters. So I've called a function here called when they hit start, add the monsters. So I find add monsters, bam. Actually, let's add the player first. The player is easier. Let's add the player. So I create a function. I say go to the game board, which is right here, and append to this object right here. So right underneath here, it's going to add a div called ID equals player, like that. So it's going to add that to the list. So it says add that, and it would add it. But now you won't see it if you look at the page. It just adds it virtually, and it's there, but you don't have to, it's just, you have to know that that's what it did. It added it, it appended it to this div. So when it added it, I then said, well, now that it's on the board, I want to change the content of it, and I want to add the image of the mouse. And it just adds that as the HTML in between those two div tags. So in between right here, it's going to add that. Now I could have just copied this right here, and I could have pasted it right there. That would have done the same thing. Just wanted to show you this method here. All right, and then I say start the player at top 0, left 0. So it's going to start them right up there. So it's added the player. Now, if you add multiple ones, I could add player 2, you can do lots of different things from this position. So when I hit start, bam, there it is. Started it. Okay. Add cheese. Where's the cheese? There's add cheese. So I said remove any old cheese. So I just said if there was ever a win, I called it hashtag win, but you'll notice it's not on the board here. So it's being virtually added and appended below it. It just adds it right after game over. And so it says if there was any win cheese before, get rid of it. Then append a new win. So that's just one cheese. And then cheese top, cheese left. So I created these two global variables. Now there's some fancy stuff happening here, but we'll explain that in a second. And then here I'm going to position the cheese at the top position, whatever it's figured out as, and the left position is whatever it showed as, and then I'm going to show it. Okay? And then inside of it, I'm going to append this HTML. Now I could have done it all up here. Since this is object oriented, I could have gone here and put .html and added this right away. I don't need this extra code here. I could have put .html and then the stuff in there. Okay, that's totally legitimate, and it's the nice thing about object oriented programming that you can just keep adding these methods to it. All right, and that'll make it look like cheese, which you can see it randomly was positioned there. So see, I started again, it randomly moved again. Okay, how did I do that? Well, I use this function called math.floor, math.random times, and then here, this method says look at the game board, get the height of it. Look at the win position, okay, and however big the win is, I think it was 20 pixels, subtract that. So now it's going to pick a random number between 0 and, this was 400 high, so it's going to be 400 less 20. So this is really 380. So that's 380 pixels, because I don't want the cheese to go off the screen. That's why I subtracted the height of it, because it could have picked 400 and the cheese would be sitting off the screen. You'd never get it. Same thing with the width. Okay, so now what's cool about this, if I go into, if I go up to here and I change the cheese size, right? If I change the cheese size or anything on here, where's the cheese? Oh, I called it win. See how it's 30? If I change this to 80 and 80, watch this, it's super cool. Look at that. And it automatically knows that it will not put it off the screen, because what happens is it always checks to make sure that the random position I'm getting from 0 to anywhere is going to be less the amount of the height of the cheese. Therefore, this number is only allowed to go to, this is now 80, so it's only going to go to 400, 320. So the position of this will never be more than 320. Okay, it makes it easier to hit now. And that's also taken, so now if you want to make the game easier, you can do that. I ran out of time again. Okay, so that's adding the cheese. Remember, remove the cheese first, then go from there. Okay, now the monsters. The monsters are a little more complicated, but we're going to add them anyways. So here we go, we need to add them. So first thing I do is if there's any monsters on the page, get rid of them. Now I've done something different here. It's dot monster. It's not an ID anymore. I only want one cheese and I only want one player. I could have multiple monsters and I want to name them all the same. You can create different classes of monsters. You can have monster type 1, monster type 2, and so you can add monster type 1, you can add monster type 2, and you would just add these in as you need them, or they can wait for different levels, anything you want. So what I said here is the number of monsters is set by whatever level we're on. Right now we're on level 1. And it's going to add a maximum of 2 extra, because this is going to give you a number between 0, 1, and 2. So it's going to give you a maximum of 3 if you're on level 1. Okay, so that's the most you would get on level 1. It would be between 1 and 3. Then I say start at j equaling 0, less than the number of monsters in increment, and add them to the game board. So if the number of monsters was 2, it would append a monster class to the board, and it would add another monster class. Now that's the key about the classes. You can have multiple classes on the board. If you want to create different types of monsters, again, you just create a different function, call them different, give them a different class. Okay, now I'm going to do something important. I've created them, I've appended them to the board. Now I'm going to start an index at 0, because this is going from 0, 1, 2, however many there are. And I use this awesome feature here, the .monster.each function. This is a loop. It's a for each loop. Okay? And what it's going to do is it's going to look at each one of them. Okay? It's going to look at the DOM and it's going to say, how many are on there? It's going to count up how many of these it finds appended to the game board. And it goes through each one and starts to do stuff. The first one is speed multiplier. It's just based on the level. If it ever gets more than 5, just cap it at 5 so it doesn't, like, the cats don't go too fast. Then what I do is I use this. So it looks at this .monster class and says, hey, the one that you're on right now, this one, add the cat picture to it. Then, since right now it's 0, cat 0 gets a speed, random speed, gets a random position, gets a random left position, and it also gets a random direction between 0, between 0 and 1. Okay, sorry, this up here only does between 0 and 1, not 2. If the y direction is 0, it makes it up, and it makes the otherwise it makes it down. If the x direction is 0, then it makes it left. If not, it makes it right. And then I say, okay, now for the one you're currently on, make its top position whatever this random position was from 0 to whatever. And again, I had to get rid of the height of the cats, right? So if I make the cats bigger or smaller, it won't pop them off the screen or make them not fit to the bottom of the screen. So understanding this code right here, please, if you have difficulty with that, ask me in class, understanding why I'm subtracting those two things. And then I've got my left positioned right here, my monster left. And then I say show it and add the class active. We'll talk about that later. That's something we can do if we're shooting them. Later we can remove the class active and therefore it disappears. There's lots of stuff we can do with that. Okay, I had some error checking here, and then I go to the next one and the next one and the next one, and I randomly place them. So watch, if I go over here and change the cat, which is a monster, and I make them big, say 80 and 80, which is kind of ridiculous, it will automatically there's huge cats. So you can see now it's going to get out of control, because if I get to the next level, I'll just kill myself and then go. So if I get to the next level, which is shortly, I'm going to run out of time. Oh, this is harder than it looks. There we go. Oh, now they're moving faster. They're going to be harder to get away from. But you can see how quickly you can update that and fix things, and it automatically takes all of it into account by using these really important properties of using the .width method and the .height method of the game board, and that it keeps it all dynamic. Okay, so we've now learned how the game tick works, the importance of using the start function, and the game tick just goes through, and then in the check game, or sorry, when we started it, we went through how to add a monster, add player, add cheese, and how the game ticks work. So in the next tutorial, we're going to look at how to check for collisions.